So this is the experimental setup. So it's very similar to what we had going on over there, except dry beans really need to be growing at high densities for them to really do much good. So they kind of use each other to push themselves out of the ground and stand upright. And so it didn't really make any sense to grow one bean plant like we do in those buckets. So what we've been doing here is actually we basically built these boxes. And so again, the area right here in the middle, those are completely separated from the two on the side. And so if we want to grow our dry bean variety, in a soil environment, then we basically just grow it like this. So very closely mimicking what a grower's beans would be doing in 22 or 30 inch rows, which are the most commonly grown row spacings in Wyoming. And then we compare that to something that would mimic what you might see if you were to say strip till dry bean crop into an existing winter wheat cover crop, which is kind of one of the systems that we think this might have a role out somewhere in the state. And just plant the beans right next to it. So again, the reflected light goes in, but the roots don't actually interact with each other. So the roots are completely separated. We know that any impacts on the dry bean plants are not because the weeds are using nitrogen or using water or actually shading the plant. It's just from that reflected light. And one of the things that we found out fairly early on is, at least in the couple varieties we've used out in the field, the height between the soil level and where the cotyledons actually show up on this plant, we call that what we're calling the first node, the cotyledon node. And then the distance between the soil and where the unifoliate leaves come out. So that very first set of true leaves that comes out on this plant, if we can measure that early in the season, that correlates very well with how high the pods will be held off the ground late in the season. So we don't have and so that's one of the big reasons why we're doing this under some fairly controlled settings, is because all the data we have on that are just from a couple varieties that we worked with our cooperator over in southeast Wyoming. So we want to make sure that those things actually do correlate for lots of different varieties. So we're actually collaborating with Dr. Heitholt, who you're going to hear from in a little bit, where he's looking at a lot of varieties out in the field. We're using some of his plots to take lots of measurements on lots of varieties, and then we've taken a subset of those varieties based on the data we got there and are growing them in these more controlled settings to make sure that a tall variety, a short variety, and a medium variety actually all correlate well between those. Because what that'll allow us to do, if we find out for almost all bean varieties that those node heights actually correlate well with pod height late in the season, that'll allow us to screen a lot more germplasm for which bean varieties would be best for direct harvest. Without actually having to take them to harvest, we can predict which ones are going to hold those pods higher just by measuring that within the first few weeks that they're grown. So it'll allow us to basically speed up the research program and helping growers figure out which varieties to plant, which ones respond best to the presence or absence of grass. If they're going to be planting in a cover crop, should they choose different varieties than if they're going to be going in a clean till type environment. So this is the setup. You'll notice we have lots of weed barrier down. We found out last year that weeds are really amazing, and I should have known this, I'm a weed scientist. But in Albert's plots over there, we actually, in each of those buckets, we have 4 holes drilled in the bottom to make sure they drain. We had Canada thistle growing up in that. It actually swirled around the bucket because it could sense that nitrogen signal, swirled around the bucket until it found one of those holes and then filled up the entire bucket with Canada thistle roots. So we actually had Canada thistle coming out of the top of the bucket where that grass would be. As soon as we removed the grass plastic, we saw this like Canada thistle plant. It wasn't ever able to find the sun, but man, it sure knew where to head to where the sun should be. So now we're really good about putting double layer weed barrier down before we do any of these kinds of studies. So that's all I've got.